matter who you are, there's one small routine that quietly keeps your day steady. For millions of Americans, it's that first cup of coffee, the one you've bought for years. But here's what almost no one sees coming. Those familiar cans and bags may still be on the shelf today. However, behind the scenes, decisions are being made that could make some of them disappear, without headlines and without a second chance to prepare. Most people think comfort items vanish overnight. They don't. They fade out slowly, yet by the time you notice, prices have jumped or the brand is simply gone. Now listen carefully. If you want stability, don't do what everyone else does. Don't wait. Do the opposite. Pay attention while everything still looks normal. Although this sounds like just coffee, it's really about routine and peace of mind. Therefore, what comes next may feel sudden, unless you understand the pattern. And once you see it, you'll never look at that grocery shelf the same way again. Number 15. Folgers. For decades, Folgers was simply part of the American morning. It sat on the shelf, unchanged, dependable. However, that reliability is shifting. Folgers isn't disappearing all at once. Yet, certain blends are harder to find. Sizes shrink, prices rise, availability tightens quietly, although the change feels sudden when your usual option is gone. For people over 50, this matters. Routine brings calm. Familiar taste brings comfort. When a trusted product changes, it disrupts more than breakfast. Many assume a brand this big will always remain. But history shows otherwise. Big names fade slowly, one product line at a time. The smart move is simple. Know the exact blend you rely on. A small buffer isn't panic, it's preparation. And if this helps you stay one step ahead, a gentle like helps others do the same. Number 14. Maxwell House. For many households, this coffee meant one thing: reliability. It didn't need explanation, it didn't need attention. However, that sense of certainty is thinning. Maxwell House isn't disappearing overnight, yet familiar blends are becoming harder to find. Packaging changes. Shelf space narrows quietly, although the brand name still suggests stability. For people over 50, this shift matters. Routine reduces friction. Familiar taste supports calm. When a dependable option changes, mornings feel less predictable. The mistake is assuming size equals permanence. But it doesn't. Large brands often fade by removing options, not names. The smart response is simple. Know the exact version you rely on. A small backup isn't panic, it's foresight. Because when familiarity disappears, it rarely announces itself. Number 13. 8 o'clock. Coffee. This is one of those brands people recognize instantly, yet rarely talk about. It's familiar without being flashy, comfortable without being loud. However, quiet brands are often the first to slip away. 8 o'clock. Coffee still exists, yet its presence is shrinking. Classic varieties rotate out. Store availability becomes inconsistent. Although the name remains, the choices behind it are thinning. For longtime coffee drinkers, this matters. This brand represented balance. Not cheap, not trendy, just dependable. When those middle ground options disappear, replacements rarely feel the same. The risk is assuming familiarity equals security. It doesn't. Brands don't need to fail to vanish. They only need to lose shelf space. The practical step is awareness. Know which roast and grind you rely on, because once a familiar option is gone, it's usually gone quietly and permanently. Comfort fades fastest when no one is watching. Number 12. Chock Full O' Nuts. This brand carries a very specific kind of memory. City kitchens, simple breakfasts, a taste that didn't try to impress, only to last. Yet that kind of simplicity no longer fits the market. Chock Full O' Nuts hasn't vanished. However, its traditional blends are increasingly harder to find. Retail presence shrinks. Distribution narrows. Although the name still exists, the product feels less certain. For older coffee drinkers, this change is noticeable. This wasn't a brand built on trends. It was built on consistency. When that consistency weakens, trust follows. The quiet risk is waiting too long, because when availability becomes regional, choice disappears quickly, and replacements rarely carry the same familiarity. The sensible response is clarity. Know whether this is part of your routine or just a memory, because once a routine becomes a memory, it doesn't come back. Some changes don't arrive loudly. They simply stop showing up. 11. Sanka. This coffee was chosen for a reason, not for energy, not for trends, but for comfort and control. However, products made for a quieter life often get overlooked. Sanka hasn't disappeared entirely, yet its original form is becoming harder to find. Shelf space is limited. Availability varies by region. Although the name still exists, consistency no longer does. For many older Americans, this brand mattered. It allowed enjoyment without compromise. When trusted decaf options shrink, the replacement choices often feel unfamiliar or unreliable. The mistake is assuming niche means secure. It doesn't. Specialized products are often the first to be reduced when markets shift. The practical move is awareness. Know where you buy it and how often you see it, because once a familiar decaf disappears, it rarely returns unchanged. Comfort doesn't vanish loudly, it fades quietly, one shelf at a time. Number 10. Hills Brothers Coffee. This is a name that once stood for tradition. Metal cans, strong aroma, a brand that felt firmly rooted in American kitchens. Yet tradition alone no longer guarantees survival. Hills Brothers hasn't vanished completely, however its presence has thinned. Fewer stores carry it, fewer options appear on the shelf. Although the brand still exists, access is no longer consistent. For longtime coffee drinkers, this shift feels familiar and unsettling. This was a coffee you could count on without thinking. When it becomes something you have to search for, the routine is already broken. The risk is subtle. When availability becomes sporadic, dependence becomes risky. And once a brand slips out of regular rotation, it rarely returns to its former place. The reasonable response is attention. Notice how often you still see it. Notice which version you buy, because when something fades quietly, the warning signs are easy to miss. Some mornings change, not with a shock, but with an empty space where something used to be. Number 9. Yuban Coffee. This coffee once signaled something special. It wasn't everyday basic. It felt like a small upgrade, without feeling extravagant. However, premium positioning is fragile when priorities shift. Yuban hasn't disappeared completely, yet it's far less visible than it used to be. Fewer stores carry it. Options rotate out. Although the name still exists, finding it has become inconsistent. For older coffee drinkers, that matters. This brand offered a familiar step up without asking you to change habits. When that middle ground vanishes, replacements often feel either too basic or too unfamiliar. The risk is assuming premium means protected. It doesn't. When shelf space tightens, brands that don't shout are often the first to be moved aside. The sensible move is observation. Notice where you still see it and how often. Because when availability becomes occasional, it's already signaling a deeper shift. Some comforts don't disappear. They simply stop being easy to find. Number 8. Gevalia. This was the coffee that arrived differently. Not rushed, not loud. It felt considered, almost personal. Yet that slower approach no longer fits today's shelves. Gevalia is still around. However, its presence in US retail has thinned. Fewer ground options appear in stores. Distribution shifts online. Although the name remains familiar, access is no longer guaranteed. For many older Americans, this change is noticeable. Gevalia represented consistency without compromise. When a dependable option becomes harder to find, routines quietly lose their anchor. The risk is assuming availability equals permanence. It doesn't. When products move off shelves and onto websites, they're already one step away from everyday life. The practical response is awareness. Notice where you still find it, and where you no longer do. Because once a habit becomes inconvenient, it doesn't survive for long. Some things don't end abruptly. They drift out of reach. Number 7. Community coffee. This is the kind of coffee people grow up with, passed down, shared, chosen because it felt like home. However, regional loyalty doesn't always translate nationally. Community coffee remains strong in certain areas, yet outside those regions, shelf space has narrowed. Fewer stores carry it consistently. Although the brand endures, access depends more and more on location. For older households, that shift matters. This coffee wasn't about variety, it was about trust. When a familiar option becomes harder to replace after a move or a store change, routines quietly fracture. The risk is assuming local strength equals long-term security. It doesn't. When distribution tightens, even respected brands can slowly retreat. The sensible response is awareness. Notice how often you see it where you shop. Because once a staple becomes occasional, the pattern is already forming. Some traditions don't end. They simply become harder to hold on to. Number 6. Dunkin. This coffee entered homes through familiarity, not discovery. It felt recognizable before it was ever brewed. However, cafe popularity doesn't always protect grocery shelves. Dunkin' ground coffee is still sold, yet retail lines rotate often. Certain roasts disappear. Packaging changes. Although the name stays visible, the versions people rely on do not always stay put. For longtime coffee drinkers, this creates friction. What once felt consistent now requires adjustment. When a familiar option changes without notice, routines lose their ease. The risk is assuming brand strength guarantees stability. It doesn't. Retail partnerships shift quickly, and store priorities change faster than habits do. The practical response is attention. Notice which Dunkin' version you buy, and how often it's still there. Because once a retail line slips out of rotation, it rarely comes back unchanged. Some brands stay famous. Their products do not always stay familiar. Number 5. Starbucks. This is a name people recognize instantly, even if they don't drink it every day. It feels modern, established, almost permanent. However, visibility doesn't equal stability. Starbucks coffee still fills grocery shelves, yet specific retail blends come and go. Bag sizes change. Limited runs replace long-standing options. Although the logo stays familiar, the exact products do not. For older coffee drinkers, this creates uncertainty. What once felt like a reliable fallback now requires checking labels and dates. When consistency fades, confidence follows. The risk is assuming popularity protects everything. It doesn't. Retail coffee is treated differently than cafe coffee, and priorities shift quietly. The practical response is awareness. Notice which Starbucks coffee you actually buy, and whether it's still there next time. Because once a familiar option becomes seasonal, it's already unstable. Some brands stay everywhere. Their dependable products do not. Number 4. Peet's coffee. This coffee once felt like an upgrade. You didn't have to explain. Familiar enough to trust. Different enough to notice. Yet positioning in the middle is rarely safe. Peet's is still present in stores. However, its retail selection shifts often. Certain blends rotate out. Shelf space varies widely by location. Although the brand remains respected, consistency is no longer guaranteed. For older coffee drinkers, this matters. This wasn't about chasing trends. It was about knowing what to expect. When expectations change, even quality feels uncertain. The risk is assuming reputation equals permanence. It doesn't. Retail coffee lives and dies by rotation, not loyalty. The practical response is attention. Notice which Peet's blend you choose and how often it's available. Because when options start moving, stability has already weakened. Some names stay respected. Their place on the shelf does not. Number 3. McCafe. This coffee entered homes quietly, without ceremony. It felt familiar before it ever became a habit. However, familiarity doesn't guarantee permanence. McCafe retail coffee is still available, yet its presence depends heavily on store agreements. Some formats disappear. Availability varies widely by location. Although the name remains well known, consistency does not. For older coffee drinkers, that uncertainty matters. This option was convenient and predictable. When convenience fades, routines become less reliable. The risk is assuming mass appeal equals stability. It doesn't. Retail partnerships change faster than consumer habits. The practical response is awareness. Notice how often you still see it, and in which form. Because when availability becomes inconsistent, it's already signaling a shift. Some routines end not by choice, but by quiet absence. Number 2. Lavazza. This coffee arrived with history behind it, old world reputation, a sense of craft that felt reassuring. However, global brands face local realities. Lavazza is still present in the US, yet its retail availability is uneven. Some blends appear briefly, then vanish. Shelf placement changes. Although the name carries weight, access depends heavily on the store. For older coffee drinkers, this inconsistency matters. This brand offered a dependable alternative without feeling unfamiliar. When availability becomes unpredictable, confidence erodes. The risk is assuming international success guarantees local stability. It doesn't. Retail space is limited, and imported brands are often the first to rotate out. The practical response is attention. Notice which Lavazza blend you buy, and how often you see it. Because once a product becomes occasional, it stops being reliable. Some traditions travel far, but they don't always stay. Number 1. Maxwell House. This is the kind of coffee people stop noticing because it's always been there. So familiar, it almost fades into the background of daily life. And that's exactly what makes it vulnerable. Maxwell House still exists, yet many of its most traditional lines are quietly disappearing. Regional blends vanish. Shelf space contracts. Although the name remains powerful, the version people grew up with is becoming harder to find. For older Americans, this matters deeply. This brand wasn't about choice overload or experimentation. It was about knowing what the morning would taste like. When that certainty weakens, routine loses its anchor. The risk is assuming history protects the future. It doesn't. Legacy brands are often reshaped slowly, until what remains is only the name. The practical response is clarity. Know which Maxwell House coffee you rely on, and whether it's still consistently available. Because once a classic becomes limited, it's already leaving. Some things don't disappear suddenly. They become unfamiliar first, and that's the real ending. None of these coffees are about panic or fear. They're about familiarity, routine, and the small comforts that keep life steady. Preparing isn't about stockpiling for chaos. It's about protecting what already works, before choices quietly narrow. When shelves change, those who noticed early stay calm. And staying calm is always the real advantage. Keep paying attention. Stay one step ahead.